Hey everybody, it's great to see you today. Welcome to Living Power, your online Bible study where we are walking through the Bible in a year. Today is November 13th and we are studying the book of Galatians. We will be in Galatians today and tomorrow, and then we're back in the book of Acts after that. The reason that we are studying the book of Galatians and the reason in our Bible they have inserted the book of Galatians in the midst of Acts is because it is believed that Paul wrote this letter, which would have been his first letter that he wrote, to the 4 churches that he visited on his first missionary journey. Now, in our timeline, we have to understand that he's already visited these 4 places, these 4 churches, and the first missionary journey has concluded. He is somewhere else, and he has either heard from a letter or by means of someone that came and visited him, some things that are happening in these places that he is very upset over. It disappoints him greatly, and for a good reason. We're going to explain today what's so upsetting to him, what is happening behind the scenes, and what actually prompted him to write this letter to them. So the 4 churches that we're speaking about during this first missionary journey would have been Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and Pisidium. Pisidium is actually Antioch. So I say both because I'm not sure how it's referenced in the Bible that you're using. So what's actually going on here? Let's answer that question, and let's also look at why Paul visits the Jews when he's been called as an emissary into the Gentiles. Why does he always visit the synagogue first when he goes to these places? Okay, so these are the 2 things that we're going to talk about today as we look at the book of Galatians. Why don't we start with the second question first? Why does Paul preach to the Jews first? Well, there are 3 reasons for that. The first reason is that the coming of the earthly kingdom that has been foretold, the literal kingdom that has been promised all throughout the Bible that we've been reading about, depends on the Jews' acceptance of the Messiah. Okay, that is a precursor to Jesus coming back and ushering in the millennium. So, there are some people that say there is nothing that has to happen as far as end times eschatology for Jesus to come again. That's not true. What they should say is there's nothing else that it really has to happen before the tribulation period could begin, the 7-year period. But the Jews have to, and we read about this very specifically in Zechariah, that the Jews will accept Jesus as their Messiah. We know that this will happen at the point of Armageddon, where it looks like they're about to be wiped off the face of the earth. When they call on his name, he will come in an instant to rescue them, and he will wipe out their enemies and usher in his millennial kingdom. That's number 1. Number 2, Paul preached to the Jews first because the Messiah was Jewish. He had a Jewish heritage, and he just understood that they needed to understand the true gospel. Number 3, he understood that he was supposed to, that either by Holy Spirit revelation or some other means, he understood these were his instructions from the Lord, that he was to go to the Jews first, and that once they rejected the message, then he would be going to the Gentiles. So I'm just sharing with you today some possible explanations for why he chose this approach. Now, let's go back to this other very interesting question. What was actually going on in these places when Paul wasn't there that prompted him to write this letter in the first place? There was a group of people that came to be known as the Judaizers, Judaisers. These were simply very zealous Jews, Jewish people that believed in the Mosaic law, that didn't really accept the gospel of grace, did not accept that Jesus was the Messiah, but they were headstrong in Judaism and didn't really like the gospel that Paul was preaching. Everywhere Paul went, when he would preach to the synagogues. He would go to the synagogues first, And many people would come to accept his message and believe in Jesus everywhere he went. Well, I won't say everywhere he went because there were always exceptions. Many places where he went, people would believe. There were also people, though, that they were sometimes there and present with him every time poor Paul got stoned and got thrown out of the synagogue. There would be these zealous Jews that just simply couldn't accept this message and either tried to kill him, stone him, beat him, flog him, or whatever. Well, in these 4 churches, after he left, these Judaizers came in behind Paul and tried, without him being there, to undermine his teaching. They tried to discredit who he was, they tried to discredit his witness, and they tried certainly to discredit his message. And evidently, some people were confused. Well, you can imagine if you were a Jew and you had grown up as a Jew and had practiced the Mosaic Law, believed in things like the kosher law regarding foods. You'd always believed that circumcision was required for all of your males. All the covenantal laws in the Mosaic Law. And then to have someone come and preach a gospel of grace and say those things aren't required, believe in Jesus, you might be confused too. Well, if Paul has gone, he's left, and I believe he usually left some people in the churches to kind of encourage and build them up. But after he would go, these other people would come in and try to undermine his teaching and his message. And so the Judaizers were saying specifically that in order to be saved, in order to go to heaven, you had to be circumcised. Absolutely. It was absolutely required. In essence, they were saying that something was required outside of belief in Jesus in order to go to heaven. And this was just not how Paul understood the gospel message. He preached a message of belief in Jesus as the number one thing, of course, and a belief that leads into a right relationship with God. So when he wrote this letter, you'll notice in Galatians 1, you don't see the salutatory greeting at the beginning that is typical of a style of writing, first century writing when they were writing letters. He just jumps right in and defends himself. He is hot. I mean, he is on this. He cannot believe what is happening. So he is repeatedly defending, number one, that he is an apostle, that he saw Jesus and that Jesus appointed him to go. Number two, his calling, that he understands he has a calling, a life charge, if you will, a call on his head that he has to do these things. And number three, he repeatedly defended his understanding that salvation comes through relationship, through grace. It is a free gift to all who will believe, not through the law. And throughout his letter, today we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between what grace does and what the law does. And tomorrow we'll conclude the book of Galatians. I thought it was so interesting in Galatians 1:2. We see, normally you see Paul that's sure of himself, on fire, brazen, bolden, full of courage, would do things that, would scare the majority of us. He would be knocked down and then pick himself up and go again. You don't often see the insecure side of this man. And it leaves us thinking sometimes that, he never had doubts, he never was insecure. I don't think so, because I think he had doubts, and I think he was insecure during times. I think he got very down and very sad and very discouraged at different points in his ministry, just like you and just like me, just like we do as we go through life. There's a clue to this in Galatians 1 verse 2. I think that's right, Galatians 1 verse 2. He feared his efforts amounted to nothing. Oh, no, that's not Galatians 1 verse 2 either. Where I'm going with this is, in a couple of days, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit, but I'll go ahead and share it with you. In a couple of days, we're going to read about him going to the Jerusalem Council. It's referenced in the book of Galatians. Okay, we need to talk about the Jerusalem Council for just a minute. The Jerusalem Council is a meeting of the minds back at headquarters at the Mother Church. The Mother Church is not Antioch. The Mother Church is in Jerusalem. And this is where salvation spread to the four corners of the world from Jerusalem. So Paul and Barnabas and, was it Titus? I think it was Titus, the Gentile who had not been circumcised. They go back to the Jerusalem Council, and I'm going to review this again in a couple of days, but they go to the Jerusalem Council. They go before James, who is now head of the church, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. And they want to clear this whole disagreement up once and for all. Paul wants to make the Judaizers quiet about this point. He has had enough. Now, what's amazing is that it's 20 years after the resurrection that they go to this Jerusalem Council, and they actually come to a decision. Do you have to be circumcised or do you not have to be circumcised? What do you have to do to be saved? And I'm not going to tell you because in 2 days, I think it is, we're going to cover that, and I want to keep it new for you. But just understand today at this point that this is a constant struggle for the apostles. Peter has issues with it in the reading today. Peter was very pressured. I mean, major peer pressure here. Peter goes on visits too. He doesn't have missionary journeys to the extent that Paul does, but Peter travels as well. At one point in the reading today, Peter comes to where Paul is, and Paul's eating with the Gentiles. Remember, that's taboo. That is a violation of the law according to the Mosaic law. But as Peter understands it, remember Cornelius came to him, and in a vision, Peter, I think it was in Joppa, had understood that Jesus had told him, make no thing unclean. Every food is open to you, and visiting with the Gentiles and associating with all peoples is now open to you. That was a change from the Mosaic law. What you read about today in this whole thing between Paul getting mad at Peter, he had a good reason to get mad at Peter. Peter was being, again, thrown about, tossed about, very undecided, very divisive about where he stood on this whole issue of eating with Gentiles. He ate with them for a little while, but then he got really uncomfortable and he kind of pulled himself out of that, and Paul saw what he was doing and he called him on it. And he and Peter got into an argument, and he lost his friend Barnabas because of this argument. Paul was right, but Paul could be a bit of a hothead, and he got so angry and tempers and flared up. Peter was wrong. However, Peter left, Barnabas left, and at this point Barnabas and Paul actually separated. It's a very sad part from a sad part of the story. From a human perspective, it looks like it was a failure on Paul's part. However, I want to give you a spiritual perspective about this separation between Paul and Barnabas that occurs about this time in their ministry. I believe that the Holy Spirit wanted them to separate because he wanted to further the spread of the gospel in this new and unique way. If they separated, then they could have a wider reach for the gospel. So God had a plan. God permitted this to happen. He, of course, didn't want disunity and discord amongst the apostles, but he allowed it and used it to further the spread of the gospel. So that's how we can understand this separation between Paul and Barnabas. I want to give you three, and then we're going to quit. I want to give you three differences between faith and the law that Paul talks about in the book of Galatians. This is the crux of his theology and what he preached. Difference number one, Paul refers back to Abraham and saying that God gave Abraham the promise of salvation if he only believed. So faith leading to salvation precluded the law because Abraham came before Moses. Paul says the law was given through Moses for a purpose. What was the purpose? To show us our sin. Number 2, Paul says that Abraham believed and God attributed his faith, to him as righteousness. Because of his belief, you can think of belief as trust. Then, because of that, Abraham had a right relationship with God. On the other hand, Paul says the law was given by God through Moses to keep us in protective custody until the child, Jesus, would be born. Number 3, Paul says, what comes after our faith in Jesus is that we receive the Holy Spirit, and if we have the Holy Spirit in us, we are automatically adopted as sons and daughters, and we get full rights to the inheritance from God. As opposed to, if you choose to live under law, the law isn't going to qualify you to receive the Holy Spirit, and you're going to have to continue to stay in that status as a slave unto the law. Paul says you choose. You can choose either one. Both of them are open to you, but you choose. He says, this is how I've chosen, Paul says, for my life. Paul says, I have concluded that I have stopped living by the law. I used to, but I've stopped. And now I live by the letter of the law, or the spirit of the law. And that is to live my life with the lens that I love God and I love people. So here's the application for us today. Can you give up earning God's approval in any legalistic form that you are applying to your life, that you feel like you have to follow to earn God's approval? And can you start living by the power and direction and guidance of the Holy Spirit? That the Holy Spirit would guide and direct every single thing that you do. Your decisions, your waking up, your coming, your going, everything. Can you give up legalism? And in what areas of your life are you a bit legalistic? And can you embrace this gospel of grace that is based on faith in Jesus and living a life of power that is directed solely by the Holy Spirit? That is the question for us today. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. We'll continue in the book of Galatians tomorrow. I hope you'll join me then. Shalom.